When a billionaire's private jet screamed out of the sky and crashed into Clearwater Lake, single dad Jack Mercer didn't hesitate. He dove into burning fuel and dragged the unconscious CEO from the sinking wreckage. But the moment cameras arrived, he vanished into the pines. Because Jack knew something the world didn't, that jet was supposed to be safe. He'd tried to warn them years ago. They'd buried his reports, destroyed his career, and killed his wife in the process. Now the woman he saved wants answers. And Jack has to decide if the truth is worth losing everything all over again. If you're ready for a story about courage, redemption, and the cost of standing up when everyone else looks away, stay with me until the end. And when you're done, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Clearwater Valley. Quiet, predictable, and exactly the way Jack Mercer preferred it. He stood at the kitchen counter of his cabin, spreading peanut butter across whole wheat bread while Owen sat at the scarred wooden table, bent over his math homework with the kind of concentration that made Jack's chest ache with pride. The boy's tongue poked out slightly as he worked through long division, his pencil scratching against paper in the warm stillness. Sunlight filtered through the pines outside, painting gold stripes across the worn floorboards. "Dad, is 42 divided by 6 equal to 7? Owen asked without looking up. Jack smiled, pressing the sandwich halves together. "What do you think?" "I think yes, but Mrs. Henderson says I rush." "Then check it again." Owen erased something, recalculated, then nodded to himself. He was 9 years old with his mother's dark eyes and Jack's stubborn jawline. 3 years since Sarah died, and sometimes Jack still caught himself setting out 3 plates instead of 2. 6 times 7 is 42, Owen announced. "I was right." "Slow and steady," Jack said, sliding the sandwich onto a plate. "That's how you build things that last." He'd been telling himself the same thing for years now. Slow and steady, one day at a time. Keep your head down, raise your son, don't look back at what you lost. The cabin was small but solid. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and an open living area that served as kitchen, dining room, and workshop all at once. Jack had built most of the furniture himself from reclaimed lumber. The walls were bare except for a few of Owen's drawings and a photograph of Sarah holding newborn Owen in the hospital, her smile radiant and young remote now, like something from another man's life. Jack didn't keep much from before. A few tools. Some books. The schematics were locked in a file cabinet in his bedroom, hidden under tax returns and birth certificates, evidence of the engineer he used to be, the warnings he'd tried to give, the career that had been dismantled piece by piece when he refused to stay quiet. But that was years ago. Ancient history. Now he fixed small engines, repaired boats, and kept the peace. The people of Clearwater Valley didn't know about his past, and that was exactly how he wanted it. To them, he was just Jack, the mechanic who lived up the mountain with his kid, the guy who'd help you fix your carburetor but wouldn't stick around for a beer afterward. Distant, polite, safe. "Can we go to the lake after school?" Owen asked, cramming the last bite of toast into his mouth. "If you finish your homework." "I always finish my homework." "Then I guess we're going to the lake." Owen grinned, and Jack felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest. The reminder that even though he'd lost everything once, he still had the one thing that mattered most. He walked Owen to the end of the dirt road where the school bus stopped, watching as his son climbed aboard and waved through the window. Jack raised his hand in return, then stood there until the bus disappeared around the bend, swallowed by the forest. The valley was waking up slowly. Mist still clung to the lake below, and the air smelled like pine sap and damp earth. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals Jack couldn't see. He walked back to the cabin, mentally cataloging the day's work. Mrs. Patterson's outboard motor needed a new fuel line. The Simmons brothers had a chainsaw that wouldn't start. Bill Crawford's ATV was making a grinding noise that probably meant the differential was shot. Simple problems. Fixable problems. Jack had just reached for his coffee mug when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the quiet morning. A high-pitched whine growing louder. He stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes against the sun, and scanned the sky. There. A private jet, sleek and white, flying too low and too fast over the valley. Even from a distance, Jack could see it was in trouble. The nose dipped erratically, the wings wobbled, and the engine noise was all wrong. A screaming pitch that meant something catastrophic had failed. His engineer's mind kicked in automatically, analyzing what he was seeing. Hydraulic failure, maybe. Control surface malfunction. The pilot was fighting it, trying to gain altitude, but the jet was losing the battle with physics and gravity. Jack's pulse quickened. The jet banked hard to the left, nearly vertical, then rolled back the other way. For a moment it seemed to stabilize, but then the nose dropped again and the aircraft began to spiral. "No," Jack whispered. "Jack." He started running before he consciously decided to move. The jet was headed for the lake, maybe 2 miles from his cabin as the crow flies, but the terrain was rough and the trees were thick. Jack sprinted down the dirt road, his boots pounding the packed earth, his breath coming hard and fast. Behind him, the whine of the engines grew louder, more desperate. He hit the trail that cut through the forest, ducking under low branches and hurdling fallen logs. His lungs burned, his legs pumped, and overhead, the sound of the jet filled the world, a terrible mechanical scream that ended in a thunderous crash. The impact echoed across the valley like a crack of thunder. Jack burst out of the trees onto the rocky shore of Clearwater Lake, just in time to see the jet's tail section slip beneath the surface. Debris floated everywhere, seat cushions, luggage, chunks of fuselage. The water was already darkening with fuel, spreading in rainbow slicks across the blue. The cockpit was still visible, half submerged about 50 yards from shore, tilted at a sickening angle. Through the shattered windshield, Jack could see a figure slumped over the controls. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He kicked off his boots, shed his jacket, and dove. The water was shockingly cold, spring runoff from the mountains, barely above freezing. It slammed into his chest like a fist, driving the air from his lungs. But Jack had grown up in these mountains. He knew the lake. He knew cold water. He surfaced, gasping, and started swimming. The fuel made his eyes burn and his skin crawl. Every breath tasted like aviation gas and smoke. Behind him, small fires flickered on the surface where fuel and sparks had met, but the main body of the wreckage was sinking fast, dragged down by the weight of the engines. Jack reached the cockpit and grabbed the broken frame of the windshield, hauling himself up. The jet lurched beneath him, listing further into the water. Inside, a woman hung suspended by her seatbelt, unconscious, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. She was maybe 40, dressed in an expensive blouse and slacks that were now soaked and torn. Her face was pale, her lips already tinged blue. Jack tried the door, jammed. The cockpit groaned and sank another 6 inches. He punched through what was left of the windshield, ignoring the glass that bit into his knuckles, and reached for her seatbelt. His fingers were numb from the cold, clumsy, and slow. The buckle was European, different from American restraints. He fumbled with it, cursing, as water began pouring into the cockpit. The jet tilted further. "Come on," Jack growled, his fingers finally finding the release mechanism. The belt snapped open and the woman slumped forward into his arms. She was dead weight, completely unconscious, and the jet was sinking fast now, the tail already gone, the nose tipping toward the bottom. Jack hooked his arm under her shoulders and kicked backward, dragging her out through the shattered windshield. His shoulder scraped against jagged metal. His leg caught on something sharp. But then they were free, away from the cockpit, and Jack was swimming one arm toward shore, towing the woman behind him. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned. The cold was seeping into his bones, making his movement sluggish. But he didn't stop. 50 yards. 40. 30. Behind them, the cockpit slipped beneath the surface with a final gurgling sigh, sending up a burst of bubbles and debris. Jack's feet finally touched bottom. He half dragged, half carried the woman onto the rocky shore and laid her on her back. She wasn't breathing. He tilted her head back, checked her airway, clear, and started CPR. 30 compressions, hard and fast, his hands locked together over her sternum. "Come on," he muttered. "Come on." 2 rescue breaths. 30 more compressions. Water trickled from her mouth. Her chest remained still. Jack kept going, his arms burning, his wet clothes clinging to him in the morning air. He'd been trained for this years ago, during his time at Vail Aerospace. Every engineer who worked on aircraft had to know emergency response. He'd never thought he'd actually use it. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. "Breathe," he said through gritted teeth. "Breathe." And then she coughed, a wet, choking sound, and water spilled from her mouth. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, and she gasped in a ragged breath. Jack sat back on his heels, his own breath coming in harsh gasps. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by exhaustion. The woman coughed again, rolling onto her side, more water coming up. Her eyes found Jack's face, trying to focus. "You're okay," he said, his voice rough. "You're going to be okay." She opened her mouth, trying to speak, but only managed another cough. In the distance, Jack heard sirens. Someone must have seen the crash and called it in. Good. She needed a hospital. She needed warmth and oxygen and doctors who knew what they were doing. His job was done. Jack stood, his legs shaking, and started backing away toward the tree line. The woman's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes had cleared enough to really see him now, and there was recognition there. Not of him specifically, but of what he'd done. "Wait," she rasped. Jack gently pulled his wrist free. "Help's coming. You're safe." "Who?" But Jack was already moving, disappearing into the pines before the question was finished. Behind him, he heard the sirens growing louder, heard the woman call out again, weaker this time. He didn't look back. By the time the first responders arrived, an ambulance, 2 sheriff's vehicles, and Fire Chief Morrison in his red pickup, Jack was already a quarter-mile into the forest, soaking wet and shivering, heading home through the trees where no one would see him. He'd learned his lesson about being visible 3 years ago. Heroes got attention. Attention brought questions. Questions led to scrutiny. And scrutiny destroyed everything you'd built. Better to be invisible. Better to be forgotten. Jack made it back to his cabin and stood in the hot shower until the water ran cold, scrubbing the fuel and smoke from his skin. His hands were cut up from the broken windshield. His shoulder was bleeding where he'd scraped it on the metal. But he was alive, and so was she. That was enough. He bandaged his hands, changed into dry clothes, and was sitting at his workbench pretending to focus on Mrs. Patterson's outboard motor when his phone rang. It was the school. "Mr. Mercer, this is Principal Hayes. Just wanted to let you know Owen's fine, but he's heard some of the other kids talking about the plane crash this morning. We thought you should know he seemed a bit shaken." Jack closed his eyes. Of course, word had spread already. Small towns were like that. News traveled faster than lightning. "I'll talk to him," Jack said. "Thank you." He hung up and stared at the motor in front of him, not really seeing it. The phone rang again almost immediately. This time, it was Bill Crawford. "Jack, you see that jet go down this morning? Heard it was some big-shot corporate plane. Scary stuff, man. You okay up there?" "Fine," Jack said. "Thanks for checking." 3 more calls came in over the next hour. Neighbors, customers, acquaintances all wanting to talk about the crash. Jack kept his responses short, gave nothing away, and finally turned his phone off entirely. He picked up Owen from school personally that afternoon instead of waiting for the bus. His son climbed into the truck with wide eyes. "Dad? Everyone's talking about the plane. Did you see it?" Jack pulled out of the school parking lot, keeping his eyes on the road. "I saw it go down. It crashed in the lake. Was anyone hurt?" "I don't know yet. I'm sure we'll hear on the news." Owen was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "Were you scared?" Jack glanced at his son. Owen was watching him with those dark, serious eyes, Sarah's eyes. "A little," Jack admitted. "It's scary when things like that happen." "But everyone's okay now, right?" Jack wished he could promise that. Wished he could guarantee that the world was safe and fair and that bad things only happened to people who deserved them. Instead, he reached over and squeezed Owen's shoulder. "I hope so, bud." They drove home in comfortable silence, and Jack made spaghetti for dinner while Owen did his homework at the table. Normal, routine, safe. But that night, after Owen was asleep, Jack stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the dark shape of the lake in the distance. Emergency lights still flickered down there. They'd be recovering the wreckage, investigating the crash, trying to piece together what went wrong. Jack already knew. He'd seen that spiral, that loss of control. He'd recognized the behavior of an aircraft that had lost hydraulic pressure, where the flight controls stopped responding and the pilot became a passenger in a falling metal tube. He'd written a report about exactly that failure mode 6 years ago. Vale Aerospace had buried it. And 18 months later, Sarah had died in a test flight of the same model aircraft, killed by the same flaw Jack had warned them about. He tried to go public, tried to take his evidence to the FAA, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. But Vale had more lawyers than Jack had savings. They'd buried him in litigation, destroyed his reputation, and made sure no one in the industry would hire him again. So he disappeared, taken Owen, and vanished into these mountains where no one knew his name or his history. Now Vale's chickens were coming home to roost. Jack turned away from the window and pulled open the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. Underneath tax returns and medical records, he found the folder he'd kept all these years. The documentation of every warning he'd given, every email he'd sent, every meeting he'd attended where he'd explained the danger. Evidence. Insurance. Proof that he'd tried. He'd kept it locked away for 3 years, telling himself he'd moved on, that the past was behind him. But he'd never been able to throw it away. Some part of him had always known this day would come, the day when Vale's negligence would finally kill someone who mattered enough for the world to pay attention. Jack closed the drawer and locked it again. Tomorrow, he'd go back to fixing motors and staying invisible. The authorities would investigate the crash. Maybe they'd find the flaw this time. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't Jack's problem anymore. He'd learned the hard way that you couldn't fight corporations and win. You could only survive. And Jack had survived. That was enough. It had to be enough. The next morning, Jack woke to the sound of vehicles coming up his dirt road. Multiple vehicles, moving slowly, crunching over gravel and displaced stones. He rolled out of bed and went to the window. 3 black Cadillac Escalades were winding their way up the mountain, moving in single file like a funeral procession. The morning sun glinted off their tinted windows and chrome trim. These weren't local vehicles. These were the kind of SUVs that had drivers and armor plating and cost more than Jack's cabin. His stomach dropped. "Owen," he called, keeping his voice calm. "Get dressed for school, bud." He pulled on jeans and a flannel shirt, his mind racing through possibilities. Had someone seen him at the lake yesterday? Had someone talked? But who? He'd been alone on that shore, alone in those first critical minutes before the sirens arrived. The Escalades pulled up in front of his cabin and stopped, engines idling. Car doors opened in sequence, smooth, practiced, synchronized. Jack stepped out onto his porch, crossing his arms. 6 men in dark suits emerged first, fanning out with the kind of awareness that screamed executive protection. Then a woman in a gray pencil skirt and blazer stepped out of the middle vehicle, carrying a leather folder. And finally, moving carefully, bandaged and bruised, but very much alive, came the woman Jack had pulled from the lake. She was cleaned up now, her dark hair pulled back, her expensive clothes replaced but still elegant. A white bandage covered the gash on her forehead. Her left arm was in a sling. She moved like every step hurt, but her eyes were sharp and clear as they found Jack on the porch. Jack's pulse kicked up. He should have kept walking yesterday. Should have let the paramedics handle everything. Should have stayed invisible. The woman in the gray suit stepped forward, her heels clicking on the gravel. "Mr. Mercer? My name is Victoria Cross. I'm Chief Legal Counsel for Vale Aerospace. This is Cassandra Vale, CEO. Every muscle in Jack's body went rigid. Vale. Of course it was Vale. Of course the universe would throw this particular punch. Cassandra Vale stepped forward, and despite the bruises and bandages, there was steel in her posture. She was shorter than Jack had realized, maybe 5'6", but she carried herself like someone who'd spent her life being the most competent person in every room she entered. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice was steady despite the injuries. "I owe you my life. I wanted to thank you in person." Jack said nothing. Victoria Cross opened her leather folder. "Mr. Mercer, we understand you prefer privacy. We respect that. Ms. Vale simply wanted to express her gratitude and offer compensation for your heroic actions yesterday." She pulled out a document and a pen. "We're prepared to offer you $2 million in exchange for your silence regarding the incident. The NDA is standard. You agree not to discuss the crash or your involvement with media, on social platforms, or in any public forum. In return, you receive the compensation and our assurance that your privacy will be protected. She held out the document. Jack looked at it like it was a snake. $2 million, enough to secure Owen's future, pay for college, buy a real house somewhere else if they wanted. All he had to do was sign away his right to speak. No, Jack said. Victoria's professional smile faltered. I'm sorry? I said no, I don't want your money. Cassandra Vale was studying him now with an intensity that made Jack's skin crawl. She looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle, like he was a problem that didn't add up. Mr. Mercer, Victoria tried again, this is a very generous offer. I pulled someone from a wreck, Jack said flatly. I don't need to be paid for that, and I don't need to sign anything. Are we done? He started to turn back toward his cabin. Wait, Cassandra said. There was something in her voice, not command, but genuine curiosity. Jack paused against his better judgment. Cassandra was looking past him now, looking at his cabin, at the window where Jack's workbench was visible, at the papers scattered across it. Her eyes narrowed. She took a step closer, and her security team tensed but didn't interfere. She was staring at something in Jack's window, the aerospace schematics he'd left out last night when he'd gone through his files. Technical drawings of hydraulic systems and control surfaces, drawings marked with Vale Aerospace logos. Who are you? Cassandra asked quietly. Jack's jaw tightened. Nobody. Those are our schematics. That's our valve assembly. That's... She stopped, her eyes widening. Jack Mercer. Jack Mercer. You wrote the Harper Report. The world seemed to tilt sideways. The Harper Report was what they'd called his safety analysis 6 years ago, when he'd still believed that facts and evidence mattered. He'd been Jack Harper back then, before he'd legally changed his name to his mother's maiden name to escape Vale's lawyers. Cassandra took another step toward him. You're the engineer who claimed our hydraulic system was flawed. You... She stopped again, and understanding flooded her face. Sarah Harper, the test pilot who died. She was your wife. Jack felt like he'd been punched in the chest. You need to leave, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Now. Mr. Mercer, now. Cassandra held up her good hand. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to thank you for saving my life. But if you were right, if the system really is flawed, then I need to know. I just took over as CEO 8 months ago. If there's something wrong with our aircraft, if there's been a cover-up, there's been a cover-up, Jack said harshly. Your company killed my wife. Your company destroyed my career when I tried to warn people. Your company is the reason I'm here in these mountains instead of doing the work I was trained to do. So forgive me if I don't want to help you. Inside the cabin, Jack heard Owen moving around. He'd be coming out any second, wanting to know who was here. Jack couldn't let his son see this, couldn't let this world touch Owen. You need to leave, he repeated. Take your money and your NDAs and leave. Cassandra's face had gone pale beneath her bruises. If what you're saying is true, it's true. And it doesn't matter, because you people make it not matter. He turned and walked back into his cabin, closing the door firmly behind him. Through the window, he watched the Vale entourage stand there for a long moment. Cassandra said something to Victoria Cross. Victoria responded, clearly arguing. The security team looked uncomfortable. Finally, they got back into their Escalades and drove away. Jack leaned against the door, his heart pounding. Dad? Owen appeared from his bedroom, fully dressed, his backpack over one shoulder. Who was that? Nobody, Jack said. Just some people who got lost looking for the resort. Come on, I'll make you breakfast. But as he cracked eggs into a pan, his hands were shaking. Because Cassandra Vale hadn't looked like a corporate villain. She'd looked like someone who genuinely didn't know. Like someone who'd just discovered that the foundation she was standing on was rotten. And Jack knew, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't over. The past he'd tried so hard to bury had just climbed back out of the lake and driven up his mountain in a convoy of black SUVs. And this time, there was nowhere left to run. Jack spent the rest of that morning trying to pretend his world hadn't just tilted on its axis. He dropped Owen at school, fielded more questions about the plane crash with practiced deflection, and returned to his cabin to find Mrs. Patterson waiting by her boat trailer, wanting to know when her outboard motor would be ready. "Tomorrow," Jack told her, though he hadn't touched it since yesterday. "I'll have it done by tomorrow." She thanked him and drove off, and Jack stood in his driveway staring at nothing, his mind still caught on the look in Cassandra Vale's eyes when she'd recognized those schematics. The shock, the confusion, the dawning realization that something was very wrong. He forced himself to focus. Work was the answer. Work had always been the answer. He retreated to his workshop and lost himself in the familiar rhythm of diagnosing mechanical problems, testing fuel lines, cleaning carburetors, replacing worn gaskets. Simple problems with clear solutions. By lunchtime, he'd almost convinced himself that Cassandra Vale would let it go. She'd return to whatever corporate tower she lived in, surround herself with lawyers and PR people, and the crash would become another footnote in aviation history. The system would protect itself the way it always did. But at 1:15, his phone rang. Jack didn't recognize the number. He almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Mercer, this is Cassandra Vale. Please don't hang up." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "How did you get this number?" "It's listed under your business, Mercer Small Engine Repair." She paused. "I'm calling because I need to understand what happened. Not just yesterday, 6 years ago." "I already told you. Your company killed my wife." "I believe you." Her voice was steady, matter of fact. "But I need details. I need documentation. I took over as CEO 8 months ago when my father had a stroke. I've been so focused on quarterly reports and board politics that I haven't looked at old engineering files. But if there was a cover-up, if someone at Vale knew about a safety flaw and hid it, there was, and they did," Jack said flatly. "Your uncle, Harold Vale, was VP of Engineering. He's the one who buried my report." Silence on the other end. Then, "Harold is still VP of Engineering." "I know. He's also on the board. He controls a third of the voting shares through my grandmother's trust." Cassandra's voice had changed, harder now, calculating. "If what you're saying is true, he's been covering this up for 6 years while sitting on the board, while making safety decisions." "And he'll keep covering it up," Jack said. "That's what powerful people do. They protect themselves." "Not if I have proof." Jack laughed bitterly. "I had proof. I had engineering analysis, failure projections, test data showing hydraulic pressure drops under stress conditions. I had everything. They destroyed me anyway." "But you still have the documentation, don't you?" Cassandra asked. "I saw those schematics in your window. You kept records." Jack should have lied, should have told her he'd burned everything years ago and moved on. But something in her voice, the same steel he'd heard when she'd first stepped out of that SUV, made him tell the truth. "I kept everything," he admitted. "But it won't matter. Vale has lawyers who make your lawyers look like public defenders. They'll bury you in motions and NDAs and sealed settlements until nobody remembers what the fight was even about." "Maybe," Cassandra said. "But I'm not you, Mr. Mercer. No offense intended, but I have resources you didn't have. I have board access. I have independent engineering firms on retainer. I can hire forensic investigators who can't be intimidated or bought off. And most importantly, I just survived a crash that killed my pilot and nearly killed me. I want to know why." Jack closed his eyes. "Because the redundant hydraulic system isn't actually redundant. The lines run too close together through the tail section. A single penetration event, bird strike, shrapnel, even severe turbulence causing structural flex can compromise both lines simultaneously. Without hydraulic pressure, the control surfaces lock up. The pilot becomes a passenger." "That's what happened yesterday?" "I'd need to see the wreckage to be sure. But yes, that's what it looked like from the ground." Cassandra was quiet for a long moment. "Will you meet with me? Not at your home. I understand that's too invasive. Somewhere neutral. I want to see your documentation." "Why would I help you?" "Because I'm asking," she said simply. "Because I saved my own life by having a good pilot who fought that plane all the way down. And because if we don't fix this, someone else's wife or husband or parent is going to die the same way Sarah did." The sound of his wife's name in this stranger's mouth should have made Jack angry. Instead, it just made him tired. There's a diner in town, he heard himself say. Mabel's, on Route 12. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Come alone. No lawyers, no security team. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Jack hung up before she could say anything else. He stood in his workshop, surrounded by the detritus of other people's broken machines, and wondered what the hell he was doing. Getting involved would only bring pain. The smart move was to stay buried, stay invisible, protect Owen from the fallout. But Sarah's face swam up in his memory, laughing as she'd climbed into that test aircraft for the last time, confident in the engineering, trusting the systems that were supposed to keep her safe. They'd lied to her, to all of them. And Jack had spent 3 years telling himself it was over, that he'd done everything he could. Maybe it was time to stop lying. That evening, after picking Owen up from school and helping him with his homework, Jack pulled out his old files. He spread them across his dining table while Owen played with Legos in the living room. Engineering reports, email chains, meeting minutes, test data showing exactly where the hydraulic vulnerability existed. He'd written the Harper report in his 3rd year at Vail Aerospace when he'd been a rising senior engineer working on next-generation business jets. The hydraulic routing had bothered him from the beginning, too centralized, too vulnerable, but his supervisors had waved him off. The design had already been approved by the FAA during preliminary certification. Changing it would mean expensive retrofits and timeline delays. So Jack had done what engineers were supposed to do. He'd run the numbers. He'd modeled failure scenarios. He'd shown mathematically that a single impact zone could take out both hydraulic lines, leaving the aircraft unflyable. He'd presented his findings to Harold Vail personally. Harold had smiled, called Jack's work impressive but overly cautious, and buried the report in a filing cabinet. When Jack had pushed back, Harold had suggested, with perfect corporate courtesy, that perhaps Jack wasn't ready for the kind of big-picture thinking required at Vail's leadership level. Jack had gone over Harold's head to the VP of Safety. That's when things had gotten ugly. Within a month, Jack had been reassigned to a satellite facility in New Mexico. Within 3 months, he'd been written up for insubordination and failure to function as a team player. Within 6 months, he'd been offered a generous severance package if he agreed to sign an NDA and leave quietly. He'd refused. He'd gone to the FAA with his concerns. And then Sarah had died. The test flight had been routine, a shakedown cruise for a new avionics package. But a bird strike had penetrated the tail section at altitude. Both hydraulic lines failed. Sarah and the co-pilot fought the aircraft for 7 minutes before it augured into the desert outside Albuquerque. The NTSB investigation called it an unfortunate confluence of factors and recommended better bird strike protection. They never mentioned the hydraulic routing. The report was sealed as part of Vail's settlement with the families. Jack had tried to force it into the open anyway. He'd contacted journalists, safety advocates, congressional staffers, but Vail's lawyers were faster. They sued him for breach of contract, theft of trade secrets, defamation. They froze his assets. They made it impossible for him to work in aerospace. Finally, broken, Jack had taken Owen and disappeared. He'd legally changed his name from Harper to his mother's maiden name, Mercer. He'd sold everything that could be traced. He'd driven north into these mountains and started over as someone else, someone smaller, quieter, less dangerous to powerful people. Now, sitting at his table surrounded by the evidence he'd kept all these years, Jack felt the old anger stirring again. Not the hot rage he'd felt in those first months after Sarah's death, but something colder and more focused. Cassandra Vail wanted proof. He had proof. The question was whether it would matter this time. Jack gathered the documents carefully and slipped them into a waterproof folder. Tomorrow he'd copy everything. He wasn't stupid enough to hand over his only set of records. But if Cassandra was serious, if she actually wanted to fight, then maybe, Sarah's death could finally mean something. Owen appeared at his elbow, clutching his favorite Lego spaceship. "Dad, are you working?" Jack looked at his son, 9 years old, still innocent, still trusting that the world made sense. "Just organizing some old paperwork, bud. Nothing exciting." "Can we still go to the lake on Saturday?" The lake where Jack had pulled Cassandra Vail from burning wreckage 2 days ago. the lake where Vale's negligence had nearly claimed another victim. "We'll see," Jack said. "Maybe we'll go hiking instead. Would you like that?" Owen considered. "Can we see the waterfall?" "Sure." "Then, okay." Owen held up his spaceship. "This one has triple engines, so it can't crash." Jack's throat tightened. "That's good design." That night, long after Owen was asleep, Jack stood at his bedroom window, again staring at the dark shape of the lake. Emergency crews had finally cleared out, leaving only darkness and stillness. The wreckage was gone, pulled from the bottom and loaded onto flatbed trucks bound for some FAA facility where investigators would spend months analyzing metal fatigue and impact patterns. They'd find the hydraulic failure. The question was whether they'd trace it back to the design flaw or whether Vale's experts would convince them it was just bad luck. Jack's phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I mean it when I say I want to understand what happened. CV." Jack didn't respond. He set his phone on the nightstand and lay down in the darkness, listening to the cabin settle around him. Tomorrow he'd hand a billionaire CEO the ammunition to destroy her own uncle's career and possibly her company's reputation. Or tomorrow, Cassandra Vale would take one look at his documentation, realize the legal exposure, and quietly make it all disappear. Either way, Jack had made his choice. He just hoped it wouldn't cost him everything again. The next morning dawned gray and threatening rain. Jack got Owen ready for school, made him oatmeal with brown sugar, and tried to ignore the knot of tension in his stomach. "You seem weird," Owen observed, watching him over his cereal bowl. "Just tired." "Are you sick?" "No, bud, I'm fine." "Promise?" Jack reached across the table and ruffled his son's hair. "I promise. Now eat your breakfast or you'll miss the bus." After dropping Owen off, Jack drove into Clearwater Valley, a small collection of businesses clustered along Route 12 where the highway crossed Clearwater Creek. Mabel's Diner sat on the north end, a chrome-sided relic from the 1950s that served the best coffee in 50 miles, and asked no questions about who you were or where you came from. Jack arrived early, chose a booth in the back corner with sightlines to both exits, and ordered black coffee from Mabel herself, a woman in her 70s who'd been running the place since Jack had arrived 3 years ago. "You look tense, honey," Mabel said, setting down his mug. "Everything okay?" "Fine, just expecting someone." "Business or pleasure?" Jack almost laughed. "Neither, both. I'm not sure yet." Mabel patted his shoulder and wandered back to the counter, and Jack wrapped his hands around the warm mug, trying to steady his nerves. At 8:03, the diner door opened and Cassandra Vale walked in. She'd dressed down, jeans, a simple blue sweater, minimal jewelry. The bandage on her forehead was smaller today, and she moved more easily, though Jack could still see the stiffness in her left shoulder. She spotted him immediately and crossed to his booth. "Mr. Mercer." "Ms. Vale." She slid into the opposite seat, and Jack noticed she was alone. No lawyers, no security team visible through the windows. Either she'd actually listened to him, or her people were very good at staying hidden. Mabel appeared with a coffee pot. "What can I get you, hun?" "Just coffee, thank you," Cassandra said. "You sure? The breakfast special's real good. Eggs, bacon, hash browns." "Coffee's fine." Mabel filled a second mug and retreated, though Jack caught her curious glance backward. New faces were rare in Clearwater Valley, and Cassandra, even dressed casually, had an unmistakable aura of wealth and authority. They sat in silence for a moment, both holding their coffee mugs like shields. Finally, Cassandra spoke. "I've been researching you since yesterday. Jack Harper, Senior Systems Engineer at Vale Aerospace from 2016 to 2019. MIT graduate, top of your class. You specialized in hydraulic systems and control surface engineering. By all accounts, you were brilliant. That was a long time ago. You were married to Sarah Harper, test pilot, former Air Force, 6 years experience in experimental aircraft. She died in 2022 when..." Cassandra's voice caught slightly. "When one of our planes crashed during routine testing." Jack said nothing. The NTSB report attributed it to bird strike causing hydraulic failure. The investigation lasted 4 months. Vale settled with his families for undisclosed sums. Cassandra leaned forward. What the public record doesn't show is that you'd filed a safety complaint 18 months before the crash. That complaint was dismissed. And then, after Sarah died, you tried to sue Vail for negligence. They crushed me with legal fees and sealed settlements, Jack said flatly. I lost my career, my savings, and nearly lost custody of my son because their lawyers painted me as an unstable conspiracy theorist. So I changed my name and disappeared. Why didn't you go to the media? I did. No one would touch it. Vail's advertising budget is too big, their legal team too aggressive. Journalists who tried to investigate got cease and desist letters. Bloggers got sued. Eventually, everyone decided it was easier to let it go. Cassandra's jaw tightened. And my uncle knew. Harold knew about your report. He didn't just know. He buried it personally. I presented my findings to him in a closed-door meeting in March 2018. He thanked me for my diligence and said he'd take it under advisement. Then he filed it away and made sure I couldn't escalate further without destroying my career. Why would he do that? Jack almost laughed. Money, timeline, reputation. We were 8 months from FAA certification on the G750. Acknowledging a fundamental design flaw would have meant pulling the application, redesigning the hydraulic routing, and delaying the launch by at least 2 years. Vail had already invested $300 million. Your board was breathing down everyone's necks. Harold made a calculated decision that the risk was acceptable. But it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Cassandra stared into her coffee. After you called yesterday, I requested Harold's personnel files and project records from 2018. Most of them have been archived, but I found meeting minutes from that March. There's a line item. Harper Engineering Concern Re-Hydraulic Redundancy, filed for future review. Nothing else. No follow-up, no action items. That's corporate speak for "we're ignoring this," Jack said. I know. Cassandra looked up, and there was anger in her eyes now, controlled but real. I've spent the last 24 hours going through every safety file I can access without triggering alerts. Do you know what I found? Nothing. No red flags, no incident reports, no pattern of hydraulic failures, which means either your analysis was wrong or someone's been very careful about what gets reported, Jack finished. Exactly. Jack pulled out the waterproof folder he'd brought and set it on the table between them. This is everything. My original engineering report, the data I used, emails showing I tried to escalate the concern, and notes from my meeting with Harold. I've also got documentation of similar failures in related aircraft models that were quietly attributed to maintenance issues or pilot error. Cassandra reached for the folder, then stopped. Before I look at this, I need to be clear about something. If your analysis is correct, if there's a systemic flaw in our hydraulic design, Vail Aerospace is liable for not just Sarah's death, but potentially dozens of incidents over the last 6 years. We could be looking at recalls, lawsuits, criminal negligence charges. The company might not survive. I know. And you're okay with that? Jack met her eyes. Your company killed my wife. It's killed other people too, incidents that got buried or explained away because acknowledging the pattern would be too expensive. So yes, I'm okay with Vail Aerospace burning to the ground if that's what it takes to ground those planes and fix the problem. Cassandra held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. She opened the folder and began reading. Jack drank his coffee and watched her face change as she absorbed the information. First confusion, then understanding, then horror as the implications became clear. She read for 20 minutes, occasionally flipping back to cross-reference different documents, her expression growing darker with each page. Finally, she closed the folder and looked up. This is damning. Yes, this should have triggered an immediate design review and grounding order. Yes, Harold buried it. He risked lives. He killed people to protect a production timeline and his own reputation. Yes, Cassandra's hands were shaking slightly. I need to verify this independently. I need engineers who weren't involved in the original certification to review your analysis. And I need to examine the wreckage from my crash to see if it matches your failure prediction. The wreckage is probably in an FAA facility by now, Jack said. Vail will have people there watching, reporting back. If you start asking too many questions, let me worry about that. Cassandra pulled out her phone. I have contacts at the NTSB. I can request observer status for the investigation. And I know an independent aerospace firm in Seattle. People Herald doesn't own. If I send them your analysis and ask for a blind review, they'll be subpoenaed the moment Vale's lawyers find out, Jack interrupted. That's how they work. They find out who you're talking to, they threaten legal action, and suddenly nobody wants to help anymore. Then we move fast. Cassandra was already typing on her phone. We get the review done, we get evidence from the crash site, and we bring it to the board before Herald can mount a defense. Jack felt something shift in his chest, a small, dangerous bloom of hope. You're really going to fight him? He tried to kill me, Mr. Mercer. Maybe not intentionally, but his negligence put me in a plane that should never have been certified. He's been sitting on the board making safety decisions while knowing about a critical flaw. He's everything I've been trying to root out since I took over, corruption dressed up as pragmatism. Cassandra's eyes were hard. So yes, I'm going to fight him, and I'm going to win. He controls a third of the voting shares. I control another third directly, and I can probably get the independent directors on my side if I show them proof of misconduct. It'll be close, but it's doable. And if you lose? Cassandra smiled grimly. Then I go public anyway and let the FAA handle it. Either way, this ends. Jack studied her across the table. This woman he'd pulled from a sinking cockpit 48 hours ago. She looked fragile still, bruised and bandaged, moving carefully because her body was still healing. But there was steel underneath. The kind of steel that made someone climb into a boardroom full of powerful men and call them liars to their faces. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time the truth would actually matter. Or maybe Cassandra Vale would discover what Jack had learned years ago, that justice was a story powerful people told to keep everyone else quiet. I need to get to work, Jack said, standing. You've got copies of everything. Do what you need to do. Just leave me and my son out of it as much as possible. I can't have my name in the news again. Owen's been through enough. Cassandra stood as well, holding the folder. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. I know what it cost you to keep these records. I know what it's costing you to share them now. Jack nodded and turned to leave. One more thing, Cassandra called after him. He stopped. Sarah was an exceptional pilot. I've read her service record and her evaluation reports. She deserved better than what happened to her. I'm going to make sure people know that. Jack's throat tightened. He managed another nod, then pushed out through the diner door into the gray morning. As he drove back toward his cabin, his phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but the number looked local. Mr. Mercer, this is Sheriff Collins. I hate to bother you, but we've got a situation developing in town. Seems there's been some talk about your involvement in the plane crash rescue. Social media's picked it up, and we've got outside media starting to sniff around. Thought you should know. Jack's stomach dropped. What kind of talk? Someone posted a video online. Phone footage from the lakeshore, taken right after the crash. You're visible in it, pulling Ms. Vale to shore. It's gone viral, 2 million views so far. People are calling you a hero. I don't want to be a hero. I understand that, Jack, but you might want to prepare yourself. When stories like this blow up, reporters tend to dig. And once they start digging, they'll find Jack Harper, Jack finished quietly. Yeah, look, I'll do what I can to keep them off your property, but I can't control social media or out-of-state journalists. You might want to think about a statement or something. Thanks for the warning, Sheriff. Jack hung up and pulled over to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. 2 million views, viral video, reporters digging, everything he'd built, the anonymity, the quiet life, the safety, was about to collapse. And Owen would be caught in the middle of it. Jack's phone buzzed again. A text message from an unknown number. Jack Mercer, I'm a producer with CNN. We'd love to talk to you about your heroic rescue. Please call me at... Another buzz, another message from a different number. Mr. Mercer, I'm writing a story about the crash for the Times. Can we set up an interview? And another. Jack, amazing what you did. Want to tell your story? We can pay... Jack threw his phone onto the passenger seat and pressed his palms against his eyes. 72 hours ago, he'd been invisible. Safe. Forgotten. Now he was viral. And somewhere in Vale Aerospace's corporate headquarters, Harold Vale was undoubtedly watching the same video, seeing Jack's face and making phone calls to lawyers who'd already destroyed him once. The past hadn't just found Jack. It had hunted him down, dragged him into the light, and now there was nowhere left to hide. By the time Jack reached his cabin, his phone had logged 43 missed calls and over 100 text messages. He turned it off completely and sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at the worn wooden structure he'd built his life around for the past 3 years. Everything was about to change. He could feel it the way animals sense approaching storms. He forced himself inside and tried to work, but his hands were clumsy and his mind kept circling back to that video. Someone had been at the lake with a phone. Someone had filmed him pulling Cassandra from the water. And now millions of people had seen his face, heard his name, and decided he was worth investigating. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 years hiding from Vale Aerospace, and the moment he saved their CEO's life, he'd been thrust back into the spotlight he'd been desperately avoiding. At 2:30, Jack drove to Owen's school early. He parked where he could see the entrance and waited, watching parents arrive for pickup, scanning for unfamiliar vehicles or people with cameras. When Owen emerged at 3:15, Jack was already at the curb. His son climbed into the truck with his usual energy. "Dad, you're early. Did you finish Mrs. Patterson's motor?" "Not yet. Just wanted to pick you up myself today." Owen studied him with those two perceptive dark eyes. "You're doing the weird thing again." "What weird thing?" "The thing where you pretend everything's fine, but your shoulders are all tight and you keep checking the mirrors." Jack forced himself to relax his grip on the steering wheel. 9 years old, and the kid could read him like a book. "Just a busy day," Jack said. "How was school?" "Good. We did fractions. I got them all right." Owen paused. "Some kids were talking about the plane crash again. They said the person you saved is really rich and famous." Jack's stomach clenched. "People talk. Billy Henderson said his mom saw a video online. He said you're a hero." "I'm not a hero, bud. I just did what anyone would do." "But you saved someone's life." Jack pulled onto the main road, heading back toward the mountain. "Sometimes people need help and you help them. That's all it is. It doesn't make you special." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mom was a hero, wasn't she, when she was a pilot?" The question hit Jack like a physical blow. Owen rarely talked about Sarah anymore. In the beginning, right after she died, he'd asked constant questions. Where did she go? When was she coming back? Why couldn't the doctors fix her? But as time passed and the memories faded, he'd stopped asking. Sometimes Jack wondered if Owen even remembered her face outside of photographs. "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "Your mom was a hero. She was brave and smart, and she saved a lot of people. I wish I remembered her better." "Me too, bud." They drove the rest of the way in silence, and Jack felt the weight of all his choices pressing down on him. He'd tried so hard to protect Owen from the past, from the truth about what had happened to Sarah and why they'd had to leave their old life behind. But maybe protection wasn't the same thing as safety. Maybe hiding from the truth just meant it could hurt you worse when it finally caught up. Back at the cabin, Jack made Owen a snack and set him up with homework while he retreated to his workshop. He needed to think, needed to plan, because the media attention was just the beginning. Once reporters started digging into Jack Mercer's background, they'd find the gaps. They'd discover the name change. They'd uncover Jack Harper and the lawsuit against Vale Aerospace. And then the story would become something entirely different. His phone rang from where he'd left it on the workbench. He'd turned it back on out of habit, and now he regretted it. But when he checked the screen, he saw Cassandra's name. He answered. "What? Have you seen the video?" Her voice was tight. "Sheriff Collins told me about it. 2 million views. Try 12 million now, and it's not just the rescue footage anymore. Someone's connected you to Vale Aerospace. There are Reddit threads, Twitter speculation, people claiming you're part of some elaborate PR stunt. The conspiracy theories are getting worse by the hour." Jack closed his eyes. "Of course they are. I'm trying to get ahead of this. I've got my PR team drafting a statement thanking you for the rescue and asking for privacy. But Jack, there are people claiming you staged the whole thing, that you somehow knew about the crash in advance, that you're either a Vale plant or a stalker or none of that matters." Jack interrupted. "Let them think what they want. It matters because it's affecting the investigation. The FAA is getting questions about whether the crash was suspicious. My board is panicking because this is exactly the kind of media circus they hate. And Harold, she stopped. Harold what? He called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He says we need to address the security implications of the crash and the troubling connections that are emerging. He's going to try to paint you as a threat, Jack. He's going to use this media frenzy to discredit you before I can present the engineering evidence. Jack laughed bitterly. I told you, this is what they do. They control the narrative. They make the whistleblower look crazy so nobody listens to the actual evidence. I'm not going to let that happen. You can't stop it. Harold has decades of experience destroying people who threaten Vale's reputation. I'm just the latest in a long line. Then help me fight back. Cassandra's voice was urgent now. Come to New York. Testify at the board meeting. Look them in the eye and tell them what you told me about the hydraulic flaw. They can't ignore both of us. I can't leave Owen. Bring him. We'll put you up in a hotel, keep you safe, give you security. No. Jack's voice was hard. I'm not dragging my son into this. He's been through enough. Jack, if we don't stop Harold now, the evidence gets buried again. The investigation gets steered toward pilot error or bird strike or any of a dozen explanations that avoid the real problem. And in 5 years, someone else's wife dies because we let the moment pass. Jack wanted to hang up, wanted to throw his phone into the lake and pretend this conversation had never happened. But Sarah's face swam up in his memory. Her smile as she'd kissed him goodbye that last morning, confident in her aircraft, trusting the systems that would kill her. I'll think about it, he said finally. Thank you. That's all I'm asking. Just think about it. She hung up, and Jack stood in his workshop surrounded by broken machines that he knew how to fix, wishing human systems were as simple as carburetors and fuel pumps. That evening, after dinner, Jack sat Owen down at the kitchen table. Bud, we need to talk about something. Owen looked up from his Legos with immediate concern. Are we in trouble? No. But things might get complicated for a little while. You know how people have been talking about the plane crash? Yeah. Well, more people are going to be talking about it. Reporters might come around asking questions. People might say things about me that aren't true. And I need you to understand that whatever you hear, whatever people say, I'm still your dad. Nothing changes that. Owen's face had gone serious. What kind of things? Jack chose his words carefully. Some people might say I'm lying about the rescue, or that I'm trying to get attention. They might dig up old stuff from before we moved here and make it sound bad. But none of it changes who we are or what we mean to each other, okay? Okay? Owen hesitated. Does this have to do with Mom? The question caught Jack off guard. Why would you think that? Because you get sad when people talk about her. And you got really sad when you heard about the plane crash. And now you're worried. Owen's eyes were too old for his face. I'm not a baby, Dad. I know something bad happened before we came here. I know that's why we don't talk about where we used to live or what you used to do. Jack felt his throat tighten. Your mom died in a plane crash. The company that made the plane, Vale Aerospace, they made a mistake. They knew their plane wasn't safe, but they didn't fix it. And when I tried to tell people, they didn't want to listen. Because they didn't want to admit they were wrong? Yeah, because admitting they were wrong would cost them money and make them look bad. That's not fair. No, it's not. Owen was quiet for a moment, processing. Is that the same company whose plane crashed into the lake? Yes. So they're still making the same mistake? Jack nodded. I think so. And the woman I pulled from the water, she wants to fix it. But it's complicated. The people who made the mistake the first time, they're still in charge. They're still trying to hide what they did wrong. Are you going to help her? I don't know yet. Owen reached across the table and put his small hand on Jack's. Mom would want you to help, so other moms don't die. The simple truth of it nearly broke Jack. He pulled Owen into a hug, holding his son tight, breathing in the smell of kid shampoo and pencil erasers and innocence. You're pretty smart, you know that? Jack said, his voice rough. I get it from you, Owen said, his voice muffled against Jack's shoulder. They stayed like that for a long moment, and Jack felt something shift inside him. He'd spent 3 years trying to protect Owen by hiding from the truth. But maybe the better protection was teaching his son that some fights were worth having, even when you were scared, even when the odds were bad. That night, after Owen was asleep, Jack pulled out his phone and composed a text to Cassandra. "I'll come to New York, but I need guarantees, security for my son while I'm gone, legal protection if this goes sideways, and your word that if the board doesn't listen, you'll take this public anyway. If I'm risking everything again, it has to be for something real." Her response came within minutes. "You have my word. I'll send a plane tomorrow. And Jack, thank you. Sarah deserves someone who wouldn't give up on her. I'm glad that person is you." Jack stared at the message for a long time before turning off his phone. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Jack called Ruth Morrison, the retired teacher who sometimes watched Owen when Jack had to work late, and explained that he needed to be out of town for a day, maybe two. Ruth asked no questions. She'd learned years ago that Jack valued privacy, and agreed to pick Owen up from school and keep him at her house. Jack packed an overnight bag, printed copies of his documentation in case the originals were somehow lost or destroyed, and tried to ignore the growing knot of dread in his stomach. At 10 a.m., a black sedan pulled up the dirt road. Not an Escalade this time, something smaller, more subtle. A man in his 50s stepped out, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket. "Mr. Mercer? I'm David Chen, head of Ms. Vale's personal security. She asked me to escort you to the airfield." "I don't need an escort." "With respect, sir, you do. There are 3 news vans parked at the bottom of the mountain road. If you drive down in your truck, they'll follow you. This way we slip past them in a vehicle they're not looking for." Jack reluctantly agreed. He locked up the cabin, said goodbye to Owen with promises to call every few hours, and climbed into the sedan's back seat. They took a service road that Jack barely knew existed, winding through national forest land before emerging on a county highway 15 miles south. No news vans followed. An hour later, they arrived at a private airfield where a sleek corporate jet waited on the tarmac. Not a Vale aircraft, Jack noted. Smart. Cassandra wasn't taking any chances. The flight to New York took 4 hours. Jack spent most of it reviewing his documentation and trying not to think about the last time he'd been in a corporate boardroom, facing down men who held his entire career in their hands. That time, he'd lost everything. This time felt different, but Jack couldn't tell if that was hope or delusion. They landed at Teterboro just after 4 p.m. Another sedan, another quiet drive through traffic. The city rose around them, steel and glass and millions of people who didn't know or care about hydraulic systems, or dead test pilots, or small-town mechanics trying to fight billion-dollar corporations. The sedan pulled up in front of a midtown hotel, expensive but not ostentatious. David Chen escorted him to a suite on the 18th floor. "Ms. Vale will meet you for dinner at 7, Chen said. "The board meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m. Until then, you're secure here. If you need anything, my number is programmed into the room phone." After Chen left, Jack stood at the window looking out over Manhattan. Somewhere in this city, Harold Vale was preparing his defense. Somewhere, lawyers were crafting arguments to discredit Jack before he could speak. Somewhere, the machinery of corporate power was grinding into motion to protect itself. Jack had forgotten how much he hated this world. At 7 p.m., Cassandra knocked on his door. She dressed for business, sharp suit, minimal jewelry, her bruises covered with makeup, though Jack could still see the fading yellow around her eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Ask me tomorrow." They went to a quiet restaurant 2 blocks away, tucked into a corner booth where they wouldn't be overheard. Cassandra ordered wine. Jack stuck with water. "I've been working on the board," Cassandra said once their drinks arrived. "I've got 3 of the 7 independent directors tentatively on our side. They're uncomfortable with Harold's timeline, the way he's pushing for a quick resolution before the FAA investigation is complete. I've told them about the engineering concerns without naming you as the source. They're skeptical but willing to listen." "What about Harold's allies?" "He's got 2 directors who will back him no matter what. They've been on the board since my grandfather founded the company. The other 2 could go either way depending on how the evidence is presented." Cassandra leaned forward. "That's where you come in. If you can walk them through the technical analysis, show them the paper trail, make it clear that Harold knew about the flaw and buried it, we might get enough votes to force an independent safety review and suspend Harold pending investigation." "Might," Jack repeated. "It's the best I can offer. Corporate boards don't move fast and they don't like scandal. But they like legal liability even less. If we can show them that Harold's negligence exposed Vail to massive lawsuits and criminal charges, they'll act to protect the company. By throwing Harold under the bus, by holding him accountable, there's a difference. Jack wasn't sure he agreed, but he didn't argue. He'd seen enough corporate politics to know that accountability usually just meant finding someone to blame while the system itself remained intact. Their food arrived, expensive steaks that Jack barely tasted. As they ate, Cassandra filled him in on the rest of her preparations. She'd hired a forensic engineering firm to review the crash wreckage independently. Preliminary findings confirmed Jack's analysis. Both hydraulic lines had failed simultaneously due to a single penetration point in the tail section. The failure mode exactly matched what Jack had predicted 6 years ago. "That's our smoking gun," Cassandra said. "Harold can't claim it was unforeseeable when you literally wrote a report forecasting this exact scenario. He'll say my analysis was speculative, that I had no way of knowing a bird strike would occur at that specific location, that proper maintenance would have prevented the failure. All of which falls apart when we show the board that you recommended design changes specifically to prevent this type of failure, and Harold ignored those recommendations." Cassandra's eyes were hard. "I've spent the last 3 days building this case, Jack. I've got the evidence. I've got the votes. Probably. What I need is for you to not back down when Harold tries to intimidate you." "I've been intimidated by experts," Jack said. "Harold doesn't scare me anymore." "Good. Because he's going to come at you hard. He knows you're the threat. He knows that if the board believes you, his career is over." They finished dinner and walked back to the hotel through streets filled with people who had no idea that tomorrow, in a boardroom high above the city, 2 people would try to hold power accountable for its failures. Jack envied those people their ignorance. Back in his room, he called Owen. "Hi, Dad." His son's voice was bright and unconcerned. "Ruth made spaghetti, and we're watching a movie about dinosaurs." "That sounds great, bud. You being good?" "Yes. When are you coming home?" "Tomorrow night, hopefully. Maybe the day after." "Okay. I miss you." "I miss you too. I'll see you soon." After hanging up, Jack lay on the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Sarah, about the morning she'd died. She'd been excited about that test flight. They were evaluating new avionics that would eventually go into commercial production. She'd kissed Jack goodbye, told him she loved him, and promised to bring home Thai food for dinner. He'd never seen her alive again. If Jack did this, if he walked into that boardroom tomorrow and told the truth, he'd be breaking open wounds that had barely healed. Owen would hear about it. The media would dig deeper. And even if they won, even if Harold was held accountable, Sarah would still be dead. But other pilots would be safer. Other families wouldn't lose what Jack had lost. It wasn't justice, but maybe it was enough. Jack slept badly, haunted by dreams of falling aircraft and sinking cockpits. When his alarm went off at 6:30, he felt exhausted and wired at the same time. He showered, dressed in the one suit he'd brought, and tried to eat the breakfast that room service delivered. At 8:30, David Chen knocked on his door. "Ready, Mr. Mercer?" "No, but let's go anyway." They took the elevator to the 42nd floor. Vail Aerospace's New York offices occupied the top 3 floors of the building: executive suites, legal departments, and the boardroom where Jack had once worked before his career had been systematically destroyed. Cassandra was waiting in the reception area. She'd armored herself in an ice blue suit and pulled her hair back severely. She looked every inch the CEO, cold and controlled and ready for battle. "They're gathering now," she said quietly. "Harold arrived 15 minutes ago. He's been in the boardroom with the chairman, probably making his case." "What's the chairman's position?" "Neutral, supposedly, but he's known Harold for 30 years. We'll see how neutral he really is." At 8:58, Cassandra's assistant, a sharp young woman named Monica, appeared. "They're ready for you, Ms. Vail." Cassandra looked at Jack. "Last chance to back out." "I'm not backing out." "Then let's go end this." They walked through polished corridors hung with photographs of Vail aircraft through the decades, sleek jets that represented billions in revenue and thousands of engineering hours. How many of them were flying with the same hydraulic flaw that had killed Sarah? How many pilots were one bird strike away from losing control? The boardroom doors were heavy oak, expensive and intimidating. Monica pushed them open. Inside, 10 people sat around a massive conference table. Jack recognized Harold Vale immediately, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy in photographs and ruthless in person. He was talking quietly with an older man who must be the chairman. When Cassandra entered, everyone fell silent. "Good morning," Cassandra said, her voice projecting confidence. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. I know this is irregular, but we have a significant safety concern that requires immediate board attention." Harold's expression didn't change, but Jack saw his eyes flicker to Jack and back to Cassandra. Recognition, calculation. "Before we begin," Harold said smoothly, "I'd like to address the elephant in the room. Ms. Vale has brought an outsider to this meeting, Mr. Jack Mercer, who recently gained media attention for his involvement in Cassandra's crash. I think we need to understand why a former disgruntled employee with a history of unfounded allegations against this company is being given access to privileged board discussions." "He's here as an expert witness," Cassandra said calmly, "and his allegations were not unfounded. That's what we're here to discuss." The chairman, identified by his nameplate as Robert Winters, cleared his throat. "Ms. Vale, this is highly unusual. Mr. Mercer has no current relationship with Vale Aerospace. His presence raises legal concerns." "Mr. Mercer has documentation of safety violations that directly relate to my recent crash and to previous incidents involving Vale aircraft. He has evidence that critical engineering concerns were deliberately suppressed by members of this board." Cassandra's voice was steel. "If you'd prefer, I can present this information to the FAA and the SEC instead, but I thought the board deserved the opportunity to address it internally first." That got their attention. Jack watched the board members exchange glances, some confused, some concerned, some already defensive. Harold stood, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing is a personal vendetta disguised as corporate governance. Mr. Mercer, or should I say Mr. Harper, since that was his legal name when he worked here, has been trying to blame Vale for his wife's tragic death for years. He's filed frivolous lawsuits, made unsubstantiated claims to regulators, and harassed our employees. Now he's apparently convinced our CEO that his conspiracy theories have merit." "They're not conspiracy theories," Jack said quietly. Every eye in the room turned to him. Jack pulled out his folder and set it on the table. "In March 2018, I submitted an engineering report documenting a critical flaw in the hydraulic routing of the G750 aircraft. The redundant system was not actually redundant. Both lines ran within 6 inches of each other through the tail section, making them vulnerable to single-point failure. I recommended immediate design review and possible production halt pending safety analysis." He pushed the folder toward the center of the table. That report was received and filed by Harold Vale, who was VP of Engineering at the time. No action was taken. 18 months later, my wife died when a G750 experienced catastrophic hydraulic failure during testing. The NTSB investigation was limited and concluded with a settlement, but the failure mode matched exactly what I'd predicted in my report. "This is ancient history," Harold said, his voice hard now. "The NTSB investigated that crash thoroughly. Their findings were clear. Their findings were limited by the scope of their investigation, which was controlled by Vale's legal team through the settlement process," Jack interrupted. "They examined the immediate cause, bird strike penetrating the tail, but they never questioned why a single penetration could take out the entire hydraulic system." He pulled out additional documents. "Since 2019, there have been 7 incidents involving G750 aircraft experiencing partial or complete hydraulic failure. All were attributed to various causes: maintenance issues, pilot error, environmental factors. But when you map the failure points, they all cluster in the same location in the tail section. Because the design flaw I identified 6 years ago is still there, still killing people, because Vale chose profit over safety." "That's a lie," Harold said sharply. "Then explain this." Jack slid across a technical drawing marked with Vale's own engineering stamps. "This is the final design schematic for the G750 hydraulic system, approved for production in 2018. Both main lines run within 4 inches of each other, even closer than I thought. Any competent systems engineer would recognize this as a catastrophic vulnerability, which means either your entire engineering department is incompetent or someone made a conscious decision to accept the risk." The board members were leaning forward now, examining the documents. One of them, a woman with sharp features identified as Dr. Ellen Reeves, spoke up. Mr. Vale, were you aware of Mr. Mercer's original report? Harold's jaw tightened. I was aware of it, yes. It was reviewed by our engineering team and determined to be overly conservative. Aircraft design involves balancing multiple constraints, so you did receive the report, Cassandra cut in, and you chose to proceed with production despite being warned of a potentially fatal flaw. I chose to trust the judgment of our senior engineers over the concerns of a junior team member who was right, Jack said flatly. Everything I predicted happened. The only question is how many people had to die before you'd admit it. The room had gone very quiet. Robert Winters looked between Harold and Jack with an expression that suggested he was rapidly reassessing everything he thought he knew. Mr. Vale, do you still have the original report Mr. Mercer filed? I'd have to check our archives. I have it right here, Cassandra said, sliding another document across the table, complete with Harold's signature acknowledging receipt and a handwritten note saying, filed for future review. She let that sink in. Future review that never happened. Harold's face had gone rigid. You're taking this out of context. Engineering decisions are complex. We consulted with experts. Which experts? Dr. Reeves asked. I'd like to see the safety review that concluded Mr. Mercer's concerns were unfounded. As would I, said another board member. Harold looked at Cassandra, and Jack saw something in his eyes shift. It was the look of a man who just realized he'd lost control of the room. I think, Harold said carefully, that we need to consider the source of these allegations. Mr. Mercer has a clear personal vendetta against this company. His wife's death was tragic, but nothing, Cassandra said, her voice cutting through his words like a blade. 3 days ago, I nearly died in a G750 crash. The preliminary forensic analysis confirms that both hydraulic lines failed simultaneously due to a single penetration point in the tail section, exactly as Mr. Mercer predicted 6 years ago. So either this is the most extraordinary coincidence in aviation history, or Vale Aerospace has been flying aircraft with a known safety flaw for years while covering up the evidence. She stood, planting her hands on the table. I'm calling for an immediate independent safety review of all G750 aircraft, a suspension of Harold Vale from all safety-related decisions pending investigation, and a complete audit of our incident reporting procedures. And if this board doesn't vote to support those measures, I will take every document in this room to the FAA, the NTSB, and the national media tomorrow morning. The room erupted into overlapping voices, questions, objections, demands for clarification. Jack sat back and watched the chaos unfold, feeling strangely detached from it all. This was the moment. This was where truth either mattered or it didn't. The chairman was calling for order, his voice rising above the din. Harold was on his feet, his face flushed, arguing something about proper procedure and hostile takeovers. Dr. Reeves was demanding to see the forensic analysis. Other board members were pulling out phones, probably calling lawyers. And through it all, Cassandra stood firm, her eyes locked on Harold with the kind of cold fury that came from realizing you'd been lied to by family. Jack thought of Sarah again, her smile, her laugh, her absolute trust in the aircraft she'd been flying. Maybe this was justice after all. Or maybe it was just the first step toward it. Either way, the fight was finally out in the open, and this time Jack wasn't backing down. Robert Winters finally managed to restore order by threatening to clear the room. The board members settled back into their seats, though the tension remained thick enough to cut. Harold had gone pale beneath his tan, his hands gripping the edge of the table. This is a serious accusation, Winters said, his voice carefully neutral. If what Ms. Vale and Mr. Mercer are alleging is true, we're looking at potential criminal liability, massive civil exposure, and regulatory action that could ground our entire fleet. But those same consequences make it imperative that we act carefully and deliberately. We can't rush to judgment based on emotion or personal grievances. This isn't emotion, Cassandra said. This is evidence. Technical documentation, incident patterns, and expert analysis all pointing to the same conclusion. Vale has been flying aircraft with a known design flaw. Dr. Reeves was reading through Jack's original report, her expression growing darker with each page. Mr. Vale, I'm looking at very specific technical concerns here. Hydraulic line proximity, stress calculations, failure mode analysis. These aren't the ramblings of someone with an axe to grind. This is professional engineering work. It was reviewed at the time, Harold said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Our senior engineering team determined that the safety margins were adequate. I'd like to see that review, Dr. Reeves said. As would I, added Marcus Chen, another board member who'd been silent until now. In fact, I'd like to see all documentation related to this issue. The original report, any safety reviews conducted in response, incident reports from the past 6 years, and the preliminary findings from Ms. Vale's crash. Harold's jaw tightened. Some of that documentation may be protected by attorney-client privilege. We're the board, Winters interrupted. We have the authority to review any company records necessary for governance decisions. If you're refusing to provide documentation, Mr. Vale, I need to understand why. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack watched Harold's face cycle through several calculations before settling on cold anger. I'm not refusing anything, but I think we need to acknowledge what's really happening here. Cassandra has been CEO for less than a year. She's facing pressure from activist investors, challenging market conditions, and now a very public crash that raises questions about her judgment. Rather than accept responsibility for the decision to fly in questionable weather conditions, she's trying to shift blame to a decades-old engineering dispute. The weather was perfect, Cassandra said, her voice dangerous. And you're deflecting. I'm providing context, Harold shot back. You brought in a man who's been trying to destroy this company for years, a man who filed frivolous lawsuits, who harassed our employees, who has every reason to fabricate evidence to support his grudge. And now you're using your position as CEO to give his delusions a platform. They're not delusions, Jack said quietly. Harold turned on him. Aren't they? You've spent 6 years blaming Vale for your wife's death instead of accepting that sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes even the best engineering and the best pilots aren't enough. Your wife knew the risks when she climbed into that cockpit. She knew that test flying is dangerous, but you couldn't accept her choice. So you've been trying to make it our fault ever since. Jack felt the words hit like physical blows. He'd heard variations of this argument before, from Vale's lawyers, from insurance adjusters, from the therapist Owen's school had recommended after Sarah died. The idea that his grief had twisted into obsession, that he was seeing patterns that didn't exist because he needed someone to blame. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if he was wrong? What if his analysis had been flawed, his conclusions colored by loss? Then he looked at the technical drawings spread across the table, the cold, objective geometry of hydraulic lines running too close together, the calculations showing insufficient redundancy, the failure modes that didn't require grief or bias to predict, just math and physics and the kind of engineering judgment that had nothing to do with emotion. You're right about one thing, Jack said, his voice steady now. Sarah knew the risks. She was one of the best pilots I've ever known, and she understood that test flying meant accepting danger, but she also trusted that the people building her aircraft were honest about those risks. She trusted that when your engineers certified a system as safe, they'd actually done the work to make it safe. She died because that trust was misplaced. He stood, pulling out another document. This is a memo dated November 2017, 5 months before I filed my report. It's from your senior hydraulics engineer to the design review committee. He raises concerns about the line routing and recommends spacing modifications. The response, signed by Harold Vale, says that implementing the changes would delay certification by 6 months and recommends proceeding with the current design while monitoring for issues in service. Jack slid the memo across to Dr. Reeves. That's not engineering judgment. That's a business decision to accept known risk because fixing it was inconvenient. And when I formalized that engineer's concerns into a comprehensive safety analysis, Harold buried it the same way he buried this memo. Dr. Reeves was staring at the document with something close to horror. Is this authenticated? It came from Vale's own document management system, Cassandra said. I accessed it 2 days ago using my CEO credentials. Everything Jack is telling you is corroborated by our own internal records. Harold had gone from pale to flushed. Those records require context. Engineering processes involve hundreds of trade-offs and judgment calls. You're cherry-picking documents to create a false narrative, then provide the full context, Marcus Chen said. Show us the analysis that justified proceeding with the current design. Show us the safety monitoring data from the past 6 years. Show us anything that contradicts what we're seeing. Harold looked at the faces around the table, faces that had trusted him, that had deferred to his expertise for decades. Jack could see him calculating whether he could still control this situation, still spin it into something manageable. Finally, Harold stood. I think it's time we adjourned this meeting and brought in legal counsel. These accusations touch on issues that could affect ongoing litigation and regulatory matters. I'm not comfortable continuing this discussion without proper representation. That's convenient, Cassandra said coldly. It's prudent, Harold countered. And if you had more experience in corporate governance, you'd understand the difference. Winters held up a hand. Mr. Vale has a point about legal exposure. However, I'm not comfortable tabling this discussion indefinitely. I'm proposing we take a 30-minute recess to allow board members to consult with counsel, then reconvene to vote on Ms. Vale's proposed measures. I object to any vote until we've had time to properly review all the evidence, Harold said. Your objection is noted, Winters said. We reconvene at 11:30. The board members filed out, most of them pulling out phones before they'd even cleared the doorway. Harold lingered, fixing Cassandra with a look of pure fury. You have no idea what you've done, he said quietly, to this company, to this family, to your father's legacy. My father's legacy will survive the truth, Cassandra replied. Will yours? Harold left without answering. Jack sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. Cassandra sat beside him, and for a moment they were both silent. You did well in there, she said finally. I felt like I was going to throw up the entire time. You didn't show it, she smiled slightly. Harold's scared. Did you see his face when Dr. Reeves started asking about documentation? He knows we have him. Having him and proving it to a board that's known him for 30 years are two different things. I know, but we're closer than we've ever been. Cassandra's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and grimaced. My PR team. The media's gotten wind that something big is happening. There are reporters in the lobby asking about an emergency board meeting. How did they find out? Someone always talks. It's fine. We were going public with this anyway. Better it happens now while we have momentum. She looked at Jack. Are you okay? I know hearing Harold weaponize your grief like that couldn't have been easy. Jack thought about it. He's been doing it for years. I'm used to it. That doesn't make it right. No, but it makes it survivable. Jack stood and walked to the window. Below, Manhattan spread out in all directions, millions of lives being lived, problems being solved, fights being fought. His battle with Vale Aerospace was just one small thread in that vast tapestry. But to him, to Owen, to Sarah's memory, it was everything. The 30-minute recess stretched to 45 as lawyers were consulted and positions were calculated. When the board reconvened, 2 additional people had joined the meeting, Vale's general counsel and an attorney representing Harold personally. Winters called the meeting to order. We've had time to consult with counsel regarding the allegations raised this morning. I want to be clear about what we're deciding today. Ms. Vale has proposed 3 measures: an independent safety review of all G750 aircraft, suspension of Mr. Harold Vale from safety-related decisions pending investigation, and an audit of our incident reporting procedures. We'll vote on each measure separately. Harold's attorney stood. Before any votes are taken, my client would like to make a statement. Winters nodded reluctantly. Harold rose, and Jack could see he'd used the recess to regain his composure. Ladies and gentlemen, I've dedicated 40 years to Vale Aerospace. I've watched this company grow from a small manufacturer into a global leader in business aviation. Every decision I've made has been with Vale's best interests at heart. Have I made mistakes? Of course. But those mistakes were made in good faith, based on the information available at the time. He looked directly at Jack. Mr. Mercer believes I buried his safety report out of malice or greed. That's not true. I believed, and still believe, that our engineering team thoroughly reviewed his concerns and determined that our safety margins were adequate. Could we have been more cautious? Perhaps. But engineering always involves balancing risk against practical constraints. That's not good enough, Dr. Reeves said sharply. You've been presented with evidence of a pattern, multiple incidents, multiple warnings, all pointing to the same design vulnerability. At some point, prudent risk management requires action, which is why I'm not opposing the safety review, Harold said. If there's any possibility that our aircraft have a systemic flaw, it should be investigated thoroughly. What I'm opposing is my suspension based on allegations rather than facts. I've committed no crime. I violated no company policy. Removing me from my position based on a vendetta would set a dangerous precedent. It's not a vendetta, Cassandra said. It's a conflict of interest. You're the person who made the original decision to proceed despite known concerns. How can you objectively oversee an investigation into whether that decision was sound? Because I have 40 years of experience and institutional knowledge that you've had less than a year to acquire, Harold shot back. You may be CEO in title, but you don't understand the complexity of what we do here. You don't understand the hundreds of variables that go into every engineering decision. You're reacting emotionally to your crash instead of thinking strategically about what's best for this company. Marcus Chen cleared his throat. With respect, Mr. Vale, I think the question before us is simpler than you're making it. Either Mr. Mercer's original analysis was sound, or it wasn't. Either you responded appropriately to that analysis, or you didn't. Those are factual questions that can be answered by an independent investigation. If you're confident in your decisions, you should welcome that investigation. I do welcome it, Harold said. I just don't think it requires my suspension. I disagree, said Dr. Reeves. If we're investigating whether safety concerns were improperly suppressed, the person accused of that suppression can't be involved in safety decisions during the investigation. It's basic governance. 3 other board members nodded in agreement. Winters looked around the table, taking the temperature of the room. Let's vote. All in favor of commissioning an independent safety review of G750 hydraulic systems? Every hand went up, including Harold's. Unanimous, Winters said. Next measure. Suspension of Harold Vale from safety-related decision-making pending completion of the investigation. Discussion? I move we amend that to a temporary administrative leave, Harold's attorney said. Mr. Vale remains on the board and continues to receive full compensation, but he recuses himself from any matters related to the G750 investigation. Winters looked at Cassandra. Would you accept that amendment? Cassandra exchanged glances with Jack, who nodded slightly. What mattered was getting Harold away from safety decisions, not punishing him. Acceptable, Cassandra said. All in favor of the amended measure? 6 hands went up. 3 stayed down. Harold and his 2 longtime allies. Motion carries, Winters said. Final measure, comprehensive audit of incident reporting procedures. Discussion? This one passed with only Harold voting against. Winters set down his gavel. This meeting is adjourned. Mr. Vale, you're on administrative leave effective immediately. You'll continue to receive your salary and benefits, but you're to have no involvement in operational decisions, safety reviews, or communications with regulatory agencies. Is that clear? Harold's face had gone stony. Perfectly clear. He stood, gathered his things, and walked out of the boardroom without looking at anyone. His attorney followed, already talking on his phone. After they left, Dr. Reeves turned to Cassandra. I want to be clear. This doesn't mean we've concluded Harold did anything wrong. But given the evidence presented, we need an objective investigation. And Ms. Vale, you'll need to recuse yourself from any board actions related to the findings. You're too close to this given your personal involvement in the recent crash. Understood, Cassandra said. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations as board members processed what had just happened. Jack found himself standing at the window again, watching the city below, trying to feel something that resembled victory. They'd won. Harold was sidelined. The investigation would proceed. But Sarah was still dead, and no board vote could change that. Cassandra appeared at his elbow. We did it. You did it, Jack corrected. I just provided the ammunition. Don't sell yourself short. Harold had been untouchable for 40 years. You're the first person who made him answer for his decisions. She paused. What happens now? For you, I mean. Jack thought about his cabin in the mountains, about Owen waiting with Ruth Morrison, about the quiet life he'd built, and the media circus that was probably descending on it right now. I go home, he said. I try to explain to my 9-year-old son why his dad had to come to New York and dig up painful memories. I fix boat motors and chainsaws and try to pretend the world makes sense. You could work here, Cassandra said. Once this settles down, Vale will need someone to oversee safety improvements. Someone who actually cares about doing it right instead of just checking boxes. The job's yours if you want it. Jack looked at her. You're offering me a job at the company that killed my wife? I'm offering you a chance to make sure it never happens again, to anyone. It was tempting, the chance to rebuild his career, to use his training for something meaningful, to turn Sarah's death into lasting change. But Jack thought about Owen's face when he'd asked if they were in trouble, about the 3 years of peace they'd built in Clearwater Valley, about the cost of living in the spotlight. I appreciate the offer, he said, but I left this world for a reason. I don't think I'm ready to come back. Cassandra nodded, not looking surprised. The offer stands. If you change your mind, call me. David Chen drove Jack back to the airport in early afternoon. The flight home felt longer than the flight out, weighted down by exhaustion and the strange hollow feeling that came after a battle you'd won, but that hadn't brought the satisfaction you'd expected. Jack called Owen during the layover. Dad, are you coming home? Soon, bud. A few more hours. How's everything? Good. Ruth let me help make cookies. We made chocolate chip. Save some for me. I will. 3 cookies. That's what we agreed on. Jack smiled despite himself. Sounds fair. When he finally landed at the small regional airport near Clearwater Valley at 8 p.m., he expected to find David Chen's discreet sedan. Instead, he found Sheriff Collins leaning against his patrol car. Sheriff? Jack said warily. Everything okay? Define okay. Collins pushed off the car. You've had quite the day from what I hear. Vale Aerospace board meeting, allegations of cover-ups, major corporate drama. How did you... It's all over the news, Jack. Hero Mechanic exposes aviation giant's deadly secret. You're trending on 3 different social media platforms. CNN wants an interview. So does the Times. Collins shook his head. I tried to keep the reporters away from your property, but there are at least a dozen camped out at the base of the mountain road. They're waiting for you to come home. Jack closed his eyes. Of course. The story was too good for the media to ignore. The grieving husband turned whistleblower, the dramatic crash rescue, the corporate conspiracy. They'd feast on it for weeks. Owen, Jack said. Is he... He's fine. Still with Ruth Morrison. I told her to keep him there tonight, give you time to secure your property before the media circus reaches him. Collins opened the passenger door of his patrol car. Come on, I'll drive you. We'll go in through the back road, avoid the cameras. Jack climbed in gratefully. They drove in silence for a while, heading into the mountains as twilight deepened into night. Finally, Collins spoke. Did you really predict that crash 6 years ago? I predicted the failure mode. I didn't predict when or where it would happen. But you tried to warn them. I tried. Collins was quiet again. Then, my brother died in a factory accident when I was 22. Conveyor belt malfunction. OSHA investigated and found that the safety guards had been removed to speed up production. Management knew about it. They'd been written up twice. They just never bothered to fix it because fixing it would have cost money and slowed down the line. Jack looked at him. I'm telling you this, Collins continued, because I understand what it's like to lose someone, because people in power decided their convenience was worth more than someone's life. And I understand why you've been hiding up in these mountains. Sometimes fighting just makes the pain worse. Is there a point to this story? Yeah, the point is that my brother's death led to new safety regulations that saved other lives. Not because anyone in management suddenly grew a conscience, but because my family made enough noise that regulators couldn't ignore it anymore. It didn't bring him back, but it mattered. Collins glanced at Jack. What you did today, testifying, bringing evidence, forcing people to pay attention, that matters too, even if it doesn't feel like enough. They reached Jack's cabin around 9. The dirt road was empty, but Jack could see lights moving through the trees below, reporters with cameras probably, waiting for him to come down the mountain. I'll post a deputy here tonight, Collins said. Keep them from coming up the road. But Jack, this isn't going away. Tomorrow there will be more media. Questions about your past, about Sarah, about why you've been hiding. You need to decide how you want to handle it. I want to not handle it, Jack said. I want to go back to being invisible. That ship sailed. Collins put a hand on Jack's shoulder. But you've got friends in this valley. We'll help you through it. Just don't disappear again, okay? Owen needs you present, not hiding. After Collins left, Jack stood on his porch, looking out at the dark shape of the lake. Somewhere down there, reporters were constructing narratives about his life, about Sarah's death, about what it all meant. They'd get some of it right and some of it wrong, and none of it would capture the actual texture of grief or the way it felt to watch your wife's coffin being lowered into the ground while your 3-year-old son asked when mommy was coming home. His phone buzzed. A text from Ruth Morrison. Owen's asking for you. I told him you'd be here in the morning. He wants to know if everything's okay. What should I tell him? Jack typed back. Tell him everything's going to be fine. Tell him I love him. I'll be there first thing tomorrow. He went inside, locked the door, and stood in his small cabin surrounded by the life he'd built from scratch. It wasn't much. Rough furniture, worn floors, a few photos on the wall, but it was safe. It was his, or at least it had been. Jack pulled out his phone and opened the news app. The headlines confirmed what Collins had said. Vail Aerospace Board suspends executive amid safety. Cover-up allegations. Crash survivor CEO takes on her own company. Whistleblower's 6-year fight for justice. There were photos of Jack, his face visible in that viral rescue video, walking into Vail's headquarters that morning. Stock footage from 6 years ago when he'd been Jack Harper with a real career and a future that made sense. The comment sections were what he'd expected. A mix of support, skepticism, and conspiracy theories. Some people called him a hero. Others called him an opportunist. A few called him a liar. Someone had dug up his old address in Albuquerque and posted it along with speculation about where he was living now. It was only a matter of time before they found Clearwater Valley. Jack turned off his phone and lay down on his bed, fully clothed. Tomorrow, he'd deal with the reporters. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to explain to Owen why their quiet life was about to get very loud. Tomorrow, he'd decide whether Cassandra's job offer was the kind of opportunity that honored Sarah's memory or just another way to keep the wound open. But tonight, Jack just let himself be tired. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, his phone was ringing. He jolted awake in darkness, disoriented, and fumbled for the phone. 3 a.m. The caller ID showed Ruth Morrison. Jack's heart seized. He answered immediately. Ruth, what's wrong? Jack, I'm so sorry to call, but Owen's having trouble breathing. I gave him his inhaler like you showed me, but it's not helping. His lips are turning blue. I think we need to get him to the hospital. Jack was already moving, grabbing his truck keys, his wallet. Call 911. I'm on my way. I'll meet you at the ER. The ambulance is already coming. Jack, he's really struggling. Keep him calm. Tell him I'm coming. Tell him to focus on slow breaths. Jack was running now, bursting out of his cabin into the cold night air. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He threw himself into his truck and gunned the engine, careening down the mountain road faster than was safe or legal. His mind was racing worse than the engine. Owen had asthma, usually mild, managed with a daily inhaler and occasional rescue doses. But sometimes, especially when he was stressed, the attacks came harder and faster than medication could handle. And Owen had been stressed. Of course he had. Dad disappearing to New York, reporters camped on the mountain, his whole world tilting sideways while adults talked in hushed voices about things they thought he didn't understand. Jack had been so focused on the fight with Vail, on Sarah's memory, on his own pain, that he'd missed what it was doing to his son. He made it to Ruth's house in 12 minutes. The ambulance was already there, lights flashing, paramedics loading Owen onto a stretcher. Ruth stood on her porch in her bathrobe, her face streaked with tears. Jack abandoned his truck in the middle of the road and ran to the ambulance. Owen! His son's face was pale and frightened, an oxygen mask covering his mouth and nose. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing, and each breath made a terrible whistling sound. Dad, Owen managed around the mask, his voice thin and scared. I'm here, bud. I'm right here. Jack climbed into the ambulance beside him, taking Owen's small hand. You're going to be okay. The doctors are going to help you breathe better." The paramedic, a woman Jack vaguely recognized from town, was already setting up an IV. Severe asthma exacerbation. We're giving him albuterol and starting steroids. His oxygen sat is 86%. That was dangerously low. Normal was above 95. "How long has he been like this?" Jack asked. His babysitter said he woke up around 2 complaining of chest tightness. She gave him his rescue inhaler, but he deteriorated rapidly. The ambulance lurched into motion, sirens wailing. Jack held Owen's hand and watched the monitors, watching the oxygen numbers climb slowly as the medication kicked in. 87, 88, 89. Owen's breathing was still labored, but the blue tinge was fading from his lips. "You're doing great," Jack told him. "Just keep breathing, nice and slow, in and out. That's it." Owen's eyes found Jack's, and they were full of tears. Not from physical pain, from fear and confusion, and the overwhelming feeling of not being able to breathe while your body screamed for air. Jack had felt that way since Sarah died. Like the world was suffocating him, and he could never quite get enough oxygen. Now his son was literally drowning in air, and it was because Jack had dragged them both back into the fight he'd promised to leave behind. They reached the hospital 20 minutes later. The ER team was ready, whisking Owen into a treatment room and setting up continuous breathing treatments. Jack stayed by his side, holding his hand, murmuring encouragement as the doctors worked. Gradually, painfully, Owen's breathing began to ease. The whistling sound faded. His oxygen saturation climbed past 90, then 95. Color returned to his face. By 5 a.m., he was stable enough to talk without the mask. "I'm sorry," were his first words. Jack felt something break inside him. "You have nothing to be sorry for, bud." "I was scared you weren't coming back. From New York. I had a dream that you didn't come back, and I woke up and I couldn't breathe, and—" Owen's voice caught. Jack pulled him into a careful hug, mindful of the IV lines and monitors. "I'm always coming back. Always. No matter what happens, no matter where I go, I'm always coming back to you. Promise?" "Promise." They sat like that until the sun started to rise, painting the hospital room in shades of gold and pink. Owen dozed fitfully between breathing treatments. Jack watched the monitors and thought about priorities and what actually mattered when everything else fell away. The fight with Vale Aerospace suddenly seemed very small and very far away. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at 7 a.m. to check on Owen. She was young, thorough, and had the kind of calm competence that made Jack trust her immediately. "His lungs sound much better," she said, listening to Owen's chest with her stethoscope. "The breathing treatments are working. We'll keep him for observation today, maybe overnight depending on how he does, but I think he's past the worst of it." "What triggered it?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Chen glanced at Owen, then back at Jack with a meaningful look. "Asthma exacerbations can have multiple triggers: environmental allergens, respiratory infections, physical exertion. But stress is a major factor, especially in children. Has there been anything unusual happening at home?" Jack looked at his son, who was watching them both with those two perceptive eyes. "Yeah, there's been some stress. I'd recommend speaking with a counselor, someone who specializes in helping children process difficult situations. Asthma and anxiety often feed into each other. The more stressed he gets, the worse his breathing becomes, which makes him more anxious, which makes the asthma worse. Breaking that cycle early is important." After Dr. Chen left, Jack pulled a chair close to Owen's bedside. "We need to talk, bud." "Am I in trouble?" "No, but I owe you an apology." Jack took a breath. "You asked me if we were in trouble, and I said no. That wasn't completely true. Things have been complicated because of the plane crash and because of what happened a long time ago with Mom. I thought I was protecting you by not talking about it, but I think I just made you worry more." Owen picked at the edge of his blanket. "I heard some kids at school talking. They said you're famous now. They said you're going to be on TV. Maybe. I don't know yet. Are we going to have to move again?" The question landed like a punch. Jack had never explicitly told Owen they were hiding, but kids were smart. Owen had figured out that their life in Clearwater Valley was built on staying invisible. "I don't want to move," Jack said carefully. I like our home. I like our life here. But some things might change. There might be a tension for a while, reporters, people asking questions. It'll be uncomfortable, but we'll get through it together. Will you have to go away again? Not like that. Not overnight, I promise. Jack squeezed Owen's hand. You're the most important thing in my life. More important than any job or any fight with any company. If something's making you this scared, I need to know about it, okay? Owen nodded slowly. I thought you went away to fight the people who hurt Mom, and I was scared they'd hurt you too. Jack's throat tightened. Nobody's gonna hurt me. I'm safe. You're safe. We're okay. But Mom wasn't okay. She thought she was safe and then she wasn't. There it was. The fear that Jack had been carrying for 3 years, now living in his 9-year-old son. The understanding that safety was an illusion, that the people you loved could disappear without warning, that trust could get you killed. You're right, Jack said quietly. Your mom thought she was safe, and the people who were supposed to keep her safe made mistakes. Bad mistakes. And that's why I went to New York, not to fight them, but to make sure they couldn't make the same mistakes again. So other kids don't lose their parents the way you lost your mom. Owen was quiet for a long moment. Did it work? I think so. We'll see. Good. Owen yawned, the medication and exhaustion catching up with him. I'm tired. Then sleep. I'll be right here. Jack watched his son drift off, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed, and he made a decision. The fight with Vale Aerospace was important. Sarah's memory was important. But Owen was everything. And if the cost of pursuing justice was his son waking up unable to breathe because fear had seized his lungs, then the price was too high. Jack pulled out his phone and texted Cassandra. Owen's in the hospital. Asthma attack triggered by stress. I can't do this anymore. Can't put him through the media circus and the investigation and everything else. I'm sorry. I gave you the evidence. Do what you need to do, but leave me out of it from here on. Her response came within minutes. I'm so sorry. Is he okay? Do you need anything? He'll be fine. Just needs rest and peace. Both of us do. I understand. You've given me everything I need. I'll handle it from here. Focus on your son. Jack turned off his phone and settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair, prepared to keep watch all day if necessary. Ruth Morrison appeared around 9 with a bag of clothes and toiletries, her face etched with guilt and worry. I'm so sorry, Jack. I should have noticed he was getting stressed. I should have. You did everything right, Jack interrupted. This isn't your fault. It's mine for not seeing what it was doing to him. Sheriff Collins stopped by around noon with sandwiches and an update. The reporters are still camped at the base of your road. I've got them cordoned off, but they're not leaving. One of them tried to hike up through the woods. We escorted him back down and explained the concept of trespassing. Thanks. There's also been some developments in the Vale situation. Thought you'd want to know. Harold Vale resigned from the board this morning. His attorney released a statement saying he's stepping down to focus on his health and to avoid being a distraction during the investigation. Reading between the lines, I'd say Cassandra forced him out. Jack felt a distant sense of satisfaction, but mostly he just felt tired. Good. The FAA announced they're launching a formal investigation into Vale's safety protocols. The NTSB is reopening several old crash investigations. This thing is really blowing up. Colin studied Jack's face. You okay with all this? I'm okay with staying out of it from now on. Can you do that? Stay out of it? I'm going to try. Owen woke up mid-afternoon, breathing easier, his color fully returned. Dr. Chen examined him again and declared him well enough to go home the next morning as long as he continued the medications and avoided strenuous activity. That night, Jack dozed in the chair beside Owen's bed while news played softly on the television. The Vale story dominated the coverage. Speculation about Harold's resignation, analysis of the company's stock price drop, interviews with aviation experts discussing hydraulic system redundancy. At one point, they showed old footage of Sarah, her official Air Force portrait, then later shots of her in Vale test pilot gear. The reporter called her one of the victims of Vale Aerospace's alleged negligence. and Jack had to bite back the urge to throw something at the screen. Sarah wasn't a victim. She was a pilot, a professional, someone who'd made a choice to push boundaries and test limits. Reducing her to collateral damage in a corporate scandal felt like another kind of violence. But that was how stories worked. The dead became symbols. The living became heroes or villains. And the truth, the messy, complicated, human truth, got lost in the noise. Jack turned off the television and sat in the darkness, listening to Owen's steady breathing, feeling grateful for something real and immediate and alive. The next morning, Jack checked Owen out of the hospital and drove him home through the back roads to avoid the reporters. Their cabin was exactly as he'd left it. Quiet, solid, safe. Jack got Owen settled on the couch with blankets and movies, then stood on his porch looking down at the lake where all of this had started. 4 days. That's all it had been since he'd pulled Cassandra Vale from burning water. 4 days that had upended 3 years of carefully constructed peace. His phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but the number was Cassandra's. "How's Owen?" she asked immediately. "Better. We're home." "Good. I'm glad." She paused. "Jack, I know you said you're done, and I respect that. But I wanted you to know what's happening. The independent engineering review confirmed your analysis. The hydraulic routing is fundamentally flawed. The FAA is issuing an emergency airworthiness directive. All G750 aircraft are grounded pending mandatory modifications." Jack closed his eyes. "How many planes?" 237 currently in service. The retrofit will take months and cost Vale over $400 million. The stock has dropped 30%. We're facing lawsuits from airlines, charter companies, and the families of people killed in incidents we now know were related to the design flaw. And Harold? The board accepted his resignation. The FBI is investigating whether he knowingly suppressed safety information, which could mean criminal charges. His career is over. Cassandra's voice softened. "You did that, Jack. You and your documentation. After 6 years, you finally got justice for Sarah." Had he? Jack wasn't sure what justice looked like anymore. Harold's career destroyed, Vale's reputation damaged, hundreds of millions in losses. None of it brought Sarah back. None of it erased the hole in Owen's life where his mother should have been. "I'm glad the planes are grounded," Jack said finally. "I'm glad no one else will die the way Sarah did. That's enough." "Is it?" Cassandra asked gently. "Because there's one more thing. The board voted this morning to establish the Sarah Harper Memorial Safety Foundation. It'll provide grants for independent safety research, support for whistleblowers, and oversight of Vale's compliance with new protocols. We're funding it with $50 million from company reserves. And Jack, we want you to run it." Jack's breath caught. "What?" "Not full-time if you don't want. You could stay in Clearwater Valley, work remotely, come to New York quarterly for board meetings. But your name carries weight now. Survivors' families trust you. Engineers respect you. You could make a real difference, not just at Vale, but across the entire aerospace industry." It was everything Jack had wanted 6 years ago when he'd first tried to sound the alarm. A platform. Resources. The ability to prevent future tragedies. Sarah's name on something meaningful, instead of just a headstone in a cemetery in Albuquerque. "I need to think about it," Jack said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. The foundation isn't going anywhere." After hanging up, Jack went back inside where Owen was watching cartoons, his breathing clear, his color good. His son looked up and smiled, open, trusting, innocent. "Dad, can we still go to the lake on Saturday?" Jack thought about the lake, about the wreckage and the rescue and everything that had followed, about whether he could stand on that shore again without seeing Cassandra's unconscious face, Sarah's crashed aircraft, all the death that water had witnessed. "Maybe we should try somewhere new," Jack said. "There's a creek about 10 miles north with good fishing. Want to check it out?" "Can we bring sandwiches?" "Absolutely." "Then, yeah, let's go somewhere new." Out of the mouths of babes, Jack thought. Sometimes the answer to trauma wasn't confronting it or processing it or finding meaning in it. Sometimes the answer was just choosing a different creek. Over the next week, life slowly found a new rhythm. The reporters eventually got bored and left when Jack refused to give interviews. Sheriff Collins removed the barriers from the mountain road. Ruth Morrison resumed her occasional babysitting. Owen went back to school and proudly told his classmates his dad was kind of famous but doesn't like to talk about it. Jack returned to fixing small engines, but now people treated him differently. They wanted to shake his hand, thank him for his service, tell him stories about their own fights against powerful institutions. He'd become a symbol, the little guy who stood up to the corporation and won, which was both flattering and exhausting. He still hadn't decided about the foundation job. Cassandra called every few days with updates. The FAA investigation was expanding to include other Vale aircraft models. Several executives had been fired. The company was restructuring its entire safety division. Harold Vale had hired a criminal defense attorney and was refusing to cooperate with investigators. "We found something else," Cassandra said during one call. "When we did the deep audit of incident reports, we discovered that Harold had been suppressing safety concerns for over a decade. Your report wasn't the only one. There were at least 5 other engineers who raised red flags about various issues, and Harold either buried their reports or forced them out of the company. How many people died because of those buried reports? We don't know yet, but we're going back through every incident, every pilot error determination, every mechanical failure that was never fully investigated. It's going to take years to untangle." Jack thought about those engineers, people like him who tried to do the right thing and been destroyed for it. How many of them had changed their names and disappeared into small towns? How many had given up on their careers, on justice, on the belief that truth mattered? "The foundation should support them too," Jack said. "Not just future whistleblowers, the ones who already tried and got crushed. They deserve something." "I'll make sure it's part of our mission," Cassandra promised. 3 weeks after Owen's hospital stay, Jack received an envelope delivered by courier. Inside was a formal offer letter for the executive director position of the Sarah Harper Memorial Safety Foundation. The salary was generous but not excessive. The terms were exactly what Cassandra had described: remote work, quarterly travel, full autonomy over grant decisions, and safety initiatives. There was also a handwritten note from Cassandra. "This isn't about Vale Aerospace. This is about making sure Sarah's death means something beyond pain and loss. I think she'd want you to take this job. But more importantly, I think you want it too. You're just scared of hoping again. Don't be." See. Jack read the letter 3 times, then set it on his workbench and stared at it for an hour while he pretended to calibrate a carburetor.